So moving on then directly into the Kantian antinomies here. There are 4 antinomies, and there are 4 theses together with 4 antitheses, together with the proofs of each of these. And the first of these antinomies is that, cosmologically speaking, the thesis is that the world has a beginning in time, and is also limited in space, or its opposite is that it has no beginning and no limits in space, and that it's infinite in terms of space and time. So the proof for the thesis that it has a beginning in time and is limited in space is that if it didn't have a beginning in time, we would be left with a paradox, namely that in order to get to the present moment, there would have to be an infinity, an eternity of temporal series of moments prior to us in order to get to this moment. So we'd be left with the paradox of an infinite time that has yet elapsed, which is an absurdity, of course. So there had to have been a beginning at some point. Likewise with space, the problem is that unless we assume that there's a boundary to space, then we're left with the problem of thinking of the world through the succession of the synthesis of the sum total of its aggregate spaces in our minds. It would take us an infinite amount of time to conceive of this in our minds, this infinite space, and so consequently space must also be limited. The counter-argument for this is simply that if we assume that there was a beginning in time, then what about the time before that? There would be an empty time prior to that, and so there would still be some kind of temporality prior to the moment of a first beginning. So, temporally speaking, the universe has to have been infinite. Likewise, with regard to space, any point where you draw a boundary in space, there's still a not space on the other side of it, which is a kind of empty void, and so we would have to imagine a finite bounded world surrounded by an empty void. So space is also infinite. Space and time are infinite. So we have these. This then is the first of the antinomies, and Kant does not yet go. He gives a little commentary, a brief commentary on each of them, but does not yet go into the problem of resolving them or critiquing them, as he will later in the chapter. In this case, unlike with the paralogisms, where you give each one then his solution of it, in this case he gives all 4 of the antinomies, then comments on them afterwards. So moving then into the next antinomy, which has to do with the composite or simple nature of matter. So we have to assume that, so the first thesis says that every composite substance in the world is made up of simple parts, and nothing anywhere exists save the simple, or what is composed of the simple. The antithesis of this will be that no composite thing in the world is made up of simple parts. These simple parts are, of course, atoms, or the Leibnizian monads, either way. The monads in Leibniz are simple units of consciousness, whereas the atoms are units of extension. But now the proof for this is that every composite, for the thesis that every composite substance is made up of the simple, is that if we try to imagine in our minds, if we try to disimagine the composite within our minds, then what would also go down the drain with that is the simple as well, and indeed even substance, and we would be left basically with nothing. So, therefore, as Kant says, it is impossible to remove the thought. In thought, all composition, or after its removal, there must be something left which is simple, namely the atoms themselves. So there has to be, matter has to be composed of something simple. The antithesis of this is that no composite thing in the world is made up of simple elements, because the problem is that if we assume that a composite thing as substance is made up out of the simple parts, then we have the problem of external relation. Space is the mode of external relation, and each of these simple components would occupy some part of space, but space itself is not composite. It's made up of spaces, but it's not composite. It's a whole that does not come into being by the synthesis of its parts. It is a whole that makes its parts possible. And so there's a conflict between the nature of space and the atomization of matter there, which doesn't seem to fit well. I think this is a bit awkward myself for this proof. But the other part of it isn't, which is, the other point made is that the problem is that everything that is real is a composite substance. So if we say that everything that is real is composite, that would include the simple as well. The simple also, we would have the paradox that the simple elements themselves would also be composite, since everything real is a composite substance. The simple would also have to be a composite substance. So matter is actually infinitely divisible. There's no point at which we can stop. In addition to the fact that the simple is not a possible object of our intuition. It's not something, it's like the soul, it's not something we can produce and say, see, here it is. It's not an object of a possible intuition. Therefore, matter is infinitely divisible. There is no simple point where we can stop and point to it and say atoms or monads. So then moving on then to the third antinomy. The third antinomy gets into the problem, whereas the first two antinomies have to do with the nature of space and time, and matter. The other two antinomies have to do with God. And so the third antinomy has to do with the problem of first cause, whether there was or was not a first cause. So we have causality versus freedom. And the thesis is that there was initially a first cause. There had to have been a first cause, since every effect presupposes a cause. And unless there was a first cause, we would have an infinite regress, in which we cannot have. That would be impossible. So there had to be a first cause that was a purely free, spontaneous act, that was itself not caused and did not have a predetermining state antecedent to it, that initiated the series of nature, which it is admitted in this thesis is bound to the law of natural necessity and causality. And on the model of this, human freedom would also be a sort of daily, common, banal imitation of this original freedom of the divine creator, since if I decide, as Kant puts it, to get up out of my chair, that's a free act that I've just initiated, a spontaneously free act which is undetermined and uncaused, that initiates a new series of things that will be causally determined as the result of that action. So human freedom is always like a miniaturization of that initial primordial cosmic first act of God that out of spontaneity produced the universe as a chain of effects. The antithesis says that there is no freedom. Everything in the world takes place through the laws of nature. The idea of having a first cause violates the completeness of the unity of nature, and so there never could have been a first cause, a first beginning. Nature is itself sufficiently guided by the law of causality, by natural law, and we don't need a first cause to make sense out of it. This is the atheist point of view, more or less. And then finally, also with the fourth antinomy, the thesis is that there belongs to the world a being that is absolutely necessary, and its proof is that the sum total of nature is composed of alterations that are themselves the result of absolute necessity. And so if they are the result of absolute necessity, there must have been a necessary being who exists as part of all this, who exists in the world and whose creative act in the beginning is part of it all. And the opposite thesis, the antithesis, is that an absolutely necessary being nowhere exists, either in or out of the world. The world does not need a necessary being. Its causality and its natural laws are sufficient unto themselves. The series does not need to be completed by an ultimate first being. That's completely unnecessary. Now, I've ran roughshod over a lot of the smaller points of each of these proofs for time considerations here. But those are the four antinomies in Nuce. And I want to draw your attention, though, to the fact that, first of all, we have the first two antinomies having to do with the nature of space, time, and matter. The second two antinomies have to do with the nature of God. But apart from that asymmetry, if we line up the first four theses against their corresponding antitheses, we have a consistency of point of view on both sides. That is to say that for the four theses, we have a point of view that could be considered consistent with a creationist cosmology, whereas the other four antitheses are consistent with an atheistic point of view. In other words, the point of view of religion in collision with the point of view of natural science. The first four theses demand that there was a creative act, that there was a primordial creative being that created, that used a first cause to bring time into being, to bound limits, to create bounded limits to the world, and to give to matter a constitutive nature, whereas the atheist denies all of that and says, no, time is infinite, space is infinite, matter is infinitely divisible, and we have an infinite regression of causes. So basically, the four antitheses of the atheist state basically that the world is lawless, or it admits natural laws, but that it has no limits. There are no boundaries to it. And so, from the point of view, if you eliminate the creator, if you eliminate the creationist cosmology, you end up with a rather arbitrary seeming world, a world with no limits in time, space, or matter, or in terms of alterations, those things which happen. There are simply no limits. So we have this collision now between science and religion. And Kant, of course, sides with the religious creationist argument. Today this would now be creationism versus evolution. It's the same basic antinomy. We're still dealing with it today. And Kant, of course, sides, practically speaking, with the creationist side. But as far as his philosophy goes, he's going to treat the creationist assertions as abuses of the reason just as much as the atheist assertions, since he wants to keep all of this out of science. It's not the domain of science to as far as Kant is concerned, to resolve these issues for us. They are matters of faith. They have no business being resolved by either scientists or philosophers. But now notice that as time went on and science evolved after Kant, precisely those things that had been constitutive characteristics of the creationist cosmology, a first cause, an absolute limit to matter, bounds in time and space, are now part of our scientific world picture, even while it does not admit, at least not officially. I know that certain individuals believe in God, certain scientists like Einstein and so forth believe in God. But as far as the official paradigm goes, God is left out. But the cosmological consequences of a creationist cosmology are imported into science now, because we do indeed have a first cause. The Big Bang is an absolute beginning. We do indeed have bounds to space. The universe is inflating like a giant balloon. And we do indeed have, matter is not infinitely divisible, we do indeed have building blocks. We have atoms or quarks or whatever the ultimate constituent parts of matter are. So all of the boundaries that Kant had here ascribed at the end of the 18th century to the creationist point of view, science has now appropriated them while leaving the creator himself out. And so we seem to be evolving a cosmology of a self-organizing, self-creating universe that simply has all the attributes and predicates of a creationist cosmology, but without actually having a bearded old rabbi creating all of this for us, which is, of course, an absurdity, and no one in his right mind today is going to accept that some bearded old Jew, not meant by this any racist implications at all, just some ethnically specific deity that created the world, is, of course, nonsense, and it's not acceptable to the reason. We don't accept that whatsoever. And so the world is seen now in contemporary science as something that creates itself. It's evolutionary. It has all the characteristics of a creationist cosmology, the very cosmology that Kant outlined here. It's not infinite in space and time. It's not infinite in terms of its material composition. It's not infinite in terms of causes. It simply created itself. And so it is possible, I think, to have a spiritualized cosmology. And this can either be spiritualized or not. I don't think there's any way to have a lawful, self-organized universe that isn't spiritual. I personally do not think that, but I know that there are scientists who do. But I think that there is spirit insofar as there's intelligence involved in all this. The universe is creating itself. It's doing it in a lawful manner, and in a manner that is not wasteful, and it knows what it's doing. All the evidence is there to support that, but that it was a bearded rabbi behind all of this is something that belongs to the cosmology of 2,000 years ago. So we'll stop there before moving into Kant's discussion of resolving these antinomies and how they work out, what his critique of them will be to resolve their dispute.